Welcome to the Del Norte County Board of Supervisors special meeting workshop scheduled for today at 5:30, Tuesday, June 6, 2017. We're going to pause for a brief moment of reflection. Jay, can you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So welcome everybody. This is the third in a series of planned workshops that the Del Norte County Board of Supervisors is having on the discussion of cannabis and the potential adoption of a cannabis ordinance here in Del Norte County in preparation for regulation if we were to adopt some form of commercial use here within the county. And the workshops, essentially the purpose of these workshops are for us as the Board of Supervisors and our staff to have the most transparent process in order to discuss and get the feedback from our community on where they would like to see some of this go. If there's pros and cons to having a commercial type operation, pros and cons to having a medical type operation. As you know, the county has had medical cannabis in place for quite some period of time, but now with legislation changes within the state of California, there's also consideration for commercial use. To that extent, these workshops are meant to bring the community together so we could get input from both sides and become as educated as possible about the current impacts, potentially that could be financial to the county, how it affects staff, how it affects people who actually want to do this commercially. Is there some viable resource or value to this by bringing it to the county? We hope that these discussions through these workshops will help shed light on it, so we as the Board of Supervisors could help make some reasonable determinations if we were to pass an ordinance that would potentially support in the future a commercial operation here within our community. Helping to lead this conversation for us is County Counsel's Office, Joel Campbell Blair, who sits here to my right. He's done a good job in helping to prepare the Board of Supervisors and our staff to have these discussions. Joel will be presenting to us tonight, specifically on criminal and civil enforcement portion of this workshop. During that period of time, we're going to have an opportunity for public to participate through a public comment period after Joel's presentation and to have some potential dialogue with the Board of Supervisors. I'd like to keep the dialogue as open as possible because we do really want feedback from the community. So we'll be a little bit more lax than we are normally at our Board of Supervisors meetings. So with that being said, I'd like to let Joel get us started for this evening.
Thank you. So tonight's topic is enforcement. No matter what ordinance the county passes, no matter how much we choose to allow or how restrictive an ordinance, it's going to have to be enforced. And while marijuana has traditionally been illegal and is still criminally illegal in some ways, we are seeing a paradigm shift at the state level. And so that's really going to be a big difference for how we police our ordinance, whatever it may be. I think it's easiest to think of this as three distinct issues, three distinct areas that need to be enforced. One is the personal cultivation, the 6 plants that now people can do as of right. We can regulate, reasonable regulations on those, but we can't prevent them, so it's going to happen. And that'll have to be enforced and held accountable in some way. The second category of things is commercial activity that is making an effort to be legal, that is trying to comply, that is looking for permits, that is trying to do the right thing, but needs to be held accountable. Like any business out there, there are violations, code enforcement helps them comply. And then the third group is kind of illegal criminal enterprises that are making no attempt to comply. These are really kind of distinct from those who are trying but maybe need a little work. These are people that are just openly committing crimes. Each of these has a different enforcement climate, and I'll talk about all of those. To recap what has already been discussed in the first two, this is a unique opportunity for counties to involve themselves in the regulation of a marketplace, which is typically a matter of statewide concern, not delegated to counties. With this comes wide discretion to craft an ordinance that doesn't just allow or ban, but to pick and choose the elements that we think are right for our community. And as a result of that, enforcement is largely a local responsibility. We can have fees and taxes and try to mitigate those costs to us, but it's primarily going to be a local issue of maintaining these ordinances. The second of these workshops, we talked about land use and where in the county it might happen. Land use is this really traditional, old-fashioned county right to decide what's allowed in the county, how intense that use should be, and where it should go. And this is the process the community uses to bargain for the good things about an industry and try to mitigate the bad things. What we covered last time is that the kind of practical places to cite marijuana grows, cultivation, is in timberland. It's kind of the big open area that's available, not in the coastal zone, not in residential, not on ag land. Anything we do there will have to be compliant with the general plan, consistent with the values the community has already laid out, or we'll have to change that general plan, and that's quite a process. So with that, enforcement can either be criminal or civil. And really, whichever direction the county goes, there will be an increased financial cost to either of those. If we are maintaining compliance for a functioning industry, that's going to be mostly code enforcement. It's going to be, use permits, permit compliance, plan checks, inspections, things that might be kind of normal business activity. If we're talking about enforcing regulations on personal recreational grows, it's going to be kind of a blend, because the violation of that 6 plants is a misdemeanor. And so the ability of the two agencies probably to work together is important. And then when things are openly illegal, criminal enterprise, while it could be a code enforcement issue, it's more likely to be still a law enforcement issue. I think one thing that I really want to make clear is what is still a felony. Now that everything has been kind of shifted down, and possession is going to be a misdemeanor if it's too much. If you have an ounce or less, if you're an adult, you're 21 or over, it's perfectly legal. If you have more than that without permits, it'll be a misdemeanor. So what is a felony is if you are possessing more than an ounce and you are 18 or over, and it's either your third misdemeanor, you are a registered sex offender, you are selling or giving to a minor, if you're importing or exporting from the state, if you are using minors in your business to deliver or sell or transport, or if in the violation of the ordinance you have somehow committed an environmental crime, like an illegal diversion or discharge, illegal the taking of endangered species, migratory non-game birds, things like that. Those will bump up your misdemeanor to a felony. And then conspiracy to commit a misdemeanor can be punished as a felony. So if you're looking at people engaged in a criminal enterprise, but nothing that either of the two people has done is a felony, the fact they're doing it together can be. So it's not that nothing's criminal anymore, or that it's all just going to be civil. or that we're just stuck with the criminal enterprise. There are some things that are still felonies and still can be enforced that way. But what probably most people would do, most things are going to be legal or small crimes. So the personal cultivation we've covered before. People are allowed to have 6 plants, but must comply with several things. One, they can have 6 plants and the marijuana they grow on those plants. Anything in excess of the 28.5 grams must be kept within the private residence or upon the grounds of a private residence, so in an outbuilding or something. The plants and that marijuana have to be in a locked space. It's not visible to normal, unaided vision from a public space. And there's no more than 6 plants per residence, so if there's 2 adults living there, they don't each get 6 plants. They combine it. And the violation of this is a misdemeanor. I'll talk a little bit more later when we get into code enforcement about how we can put reasonable regulations on these things. But this right now is kind of what comes as a package from state law. It has to be locked. It has to be not visible from the street, from a public place. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be hidden from your neighbor. If they can see it from their private property, that's not a violation of this, but that's something we can talk about with code enforcement. Realistically, if people are growing 6 plants, or they're growing them, maybe they're not keeping them locked, maybe they're growing 7 plants, maybe they have, I don't know, extra pot they didn't grow or something like that. The likelihood that law enforcement is going to be in their home or getting warrants to go search is really low. If they get a ticket for a misdemeanor, it's probably because the police were there for something else, a DV call, some other thing, some unrelated search warrant for another crime, and they happen to see it. So the personal grows, it's unlikely to be law enforcement. Similarly, it's kind of unlikely for it to be code enforcement for the same reason. You have to go and get a warrant and come and serve it. And so, the 6 plants thing is pretty hard to enforce, happens in people's houses. We can put regulations on it, and we'll talk about some of the obstacles to those. For medical personnel, there's criminal immunity under state law for having and growing marijuana in accordance with the doctor's recommendation. But the new laws, they specifically don't require a permit, a state permit, for medical grown for 100 square feet per qualified patient. So caregivers can grow 500 square feet, 100 for each qualified patient. But then the code says this exemption from the permit requirement does not limit or prevent a city, county, or city and county from exercising its police authority under Section 7, Article 11 of the California Constitution. So that right to put reasonable regulations or control the size still applies to the medical. So it's my interpretation of that you can have a law that says you can do 6 plants and here are the rules about it with really no regard for whether it's medical or recreational, which is a way to really simplify things. For commercial cultivation, from a law enforcement standpoint, you are going to have probably little involvement if they are trying to comply. Even though if you are in violation of your permit, all the criminal penalties apply, misdemeanors largely. That's true of a lot of industries that have licenses. Most have licenses are enforced by misdemeanors. It doesn't mean that police are arresting people or DAs are prosecuting people for them. The real penalty for kind of flubbing up on your permit is fines of up to 3 times the amount of the license for each violation. Those are going to be state level fines from the Bureau, and law enforcement is unlikely to be involved in that. However, our local code enforcement can be. A really important concept to keep in mind is that code enforcement is compliance oriented. It's not punitive. Where the police are out there trying to make sure people are doing kind of right, they're being safe, they're not harming people, they're being morally right. code enforcement is out there making sure people are following rules, and if they're not, helping them follow the rules. It actually says so pretty clearly in our government code, that the purpose is to protect health, safety, and welfare through the prevention of public nuisances, and it's the intention of the board the Board of Supervisors to minimize the burden placed upon property owners and taxpayers in carrying out the purposes set forth in the section. Those methods of abatement are to be favored which are least costly and which are most directly related to protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. In the notice that we give people when we find a nuisance and we move forward with the abatement process, it specifically gives them a heads up. It says those methods of abatement are to be favored which are least costly, and because voluntary compliance is the least costly method of abatement for all parties, the county desires to work with you and grant sufficient time to correct violations. So the real purpose of code enforcement is not to punish people for doing wrong, it's to help them do right. And this is kind of a fundamental perspective that the board needs to keep in mind when we're thinking about recovering our costs for that nuisance abatement. The process for nuisance abatement starts with a complaint. Then there might be an inspection or investigation by code enforcement. You give them a notice of nuisance, which is what I just read. Then there's possible fines, $100 for the first offense, $200 for the second. The third offense can be a misdemeanor. But these fines will actually be levied at the end of the process after the hearing officer kind of approves the whole thing. So after you do this notice of nuisance, you apply to the hearing officer for an order to abate. You can get a warrant to enter the property and abate if the hearing officer so orders. You abate the nuisance at county expense, and then you take the cost that it took to abate the nuisance with any fines levied. You go back to the hearing officer and you ask for an award of those things, and then you can lien the property or specially assess them. The reason that this makes code enforcement not revenue neutral, the reason that code enforcement cannot recover all of the expenses that it puts out is that if they're seeking voluntary compliance, early in that process, most people comply. And so you never get to the part where the hearing officer is giving an award of fees. And according to our code enforcement, about 80% of cases never get to the hearing officer. So we're looking at a situation where if we want code enforcement to recover fees and costs, we would have to fundamentally change the philosophy the board has set forth for code enforcement, where they're not just out there being nice guys, allowing people to voluntarily comply. They would have to be fairly harsh, going after people, finding anything that's a violation, finding them, seeking the highest possible damages, getting those abatement orders, liening every fee, and the community would possibly chafe at something like that. But these, again, aren't typical criminal things. These are building code violations like electrical or plumbing requirements, grading violations, water use, zoning violations like fence height, nuisances, old-fashioned nuisances like junk, blight, rodents, and environmental health like mold or water quality. These are the traditional things that code enforcement is out there doing. And while, if an ordinance sets forth regulations for how cannabis has to be grown, either in your home or a commercial thing, those are codes that can be enforced. But it'd be through this process where we're trying to help them get up to speed, fix the problem, get your wiring up to code, fix your whatever. And so, it's not going to be revenue neutral. In fact, Heidi shared with me the spreadsheet of the basically the budget, the revenue, the in and out for code enforcement, and they're averaging somewhere between $70,000 and $100,000, net loss every year. To make that revenue neutral will have to come from maybe fairly substantial fees for permits or pretty aggressive seeking of penalties. Some stats about code enforcement for reference. 98% of complaints, the code enforcement officer can start addressing that within a week, meaning meeting the violator and meeting the complainant. It's pretty hands-on. 2 or 3 contacts with the violator, 2 or 3 with the complainant. Minimum cases can take 2 or 3 hours. And that's going to depend on the location within the county, the degree of the violation, the number of calls. The oldest case open right now is 6 years. They're really spending a lot of time gradually moving the ball. If you've ever been in a hearing with the hearing officer, Cater, he's a real fair guy. He'll give people more and more time. If he sees progress, he's happy to inch them along. You know, it's not a process that's punitive like a court. These cases can take in excess of 150 hours of staff time. When code enforcement gets an order to abate a nuisance, the county has to go and abate it ourselves, with our own money, and then we can try to go and recoup that money. The money available to go around doing this is $14,500. So you're looking at really 1 or 2 or 3 good projects a year. And if you're talking about a marijuana grow, like a big one, where you've got environmental damage, when you've got a lot of cleanup, that's not going to go very far. And you know, the things that right now are priorities, like things that are like safety hazards or people living in vehicles or things like that, with one code enforcement officer, every pot-related call or complaint, you know, there's an opportunity cost. It'll have to be weighed. Is somebody growing 7 or 8 or 10 or even 30 plants in their house as important as this huge rodent infestation in an abandoned house? You know, there's just going to be an opportunity cost in addition to the money cost involved in that. So thinking about those two things, the fact that law enforcement's role is going to be largely for big grows and kind of openly illegal grows, and that code enforcement's role is really to help people who really mostly want to comply, or going after people who are really causing some sort of safety hazard with a limited budget. When we craft our ordinance, we have to be thinking of, A, are we going to craft one that's really easy to enforce, it's not going to take a lot more time? Or B, is it something that we're going to try to create a system of permits and fees that will cover the cost of, realistically, at least another code enforcement officer or another sheriff's deputy? Because it's not just about money, it's about opportunity cost. What are they going to do marijuana instead of? So to go to these 6 plants, the county can have reasonable regulations to reasonably regulate. That's what the code says. Reasonable typically means you have a valid reason that arises out of the county's police power. Health, safety, welfare. Doesn't always need to be a great reason. You need something, and courts usually hold it up. In addition, you can't infringe on any fundamental rights or protected rights, and you can't discriminate against protected classes. So as long as the thing isn't discriminatory or infringing on serious rights, people's families, your right to parent, your right to travel, most things are going to be, I think, reasonable regulations. If it was ever challenged, and the county could say, well, we did it because of this. We did it because of mold. We did it because of the fear that children are going to have access to. We did it because, the visual blight was bringing down property values. All of those things are probably reasonable. But reasonableness kind of cuts both ways. So we can put a bunch of these restrictions on things that are reasonable and would be upheld and might help control some of the negative impacts that the county doesn't want. But each one of those extra regulations is something that has to be enforced. And in some situations, it can actually probably increase the harm. If people are growing outside, otherwise complying with state law, it's locked, it's outside, you can't see it from the street. We could have a regulation that says it has to be covered. You can't be seen even from private property, not just the public. You might be more likely to chase people indoors where it's harder to know if they're complying. And they're more likely to be using electricity, electrical wiring and things like that. You're more likely to create mold. So, you have to really figure what's the balance of good and harms you want to create, because just any regulation on the thing that sounds good could have unintended consequences and expense for enforcement. It's not going to be probably a normal thing for code enforcement to get a complaint about a neighbor and go and get an inspection warrant to look in their house. You need probable cause. You need more than a complaint. You need some reason to think that something's in there. And if it means not doing some other work that relates to safety, it's just unlikely that that's going to be a priority. So even if staff time is technically compensated, the opportunity cost is not compensated. And I think that's really key. If we had a regime for permitting, and we could do that even for the 6 plants, say you need, some simple permit and an inspection to make sure your lights are okay, your water, or whatever mold abatement things there are. Even if these were spread out between environmental health, building inspection, code enforcement, etc., it's still some other work they're not now doing, right? You might just be spreading the need for more staff in more areas. So those are things that have to be balanced. When it comes to these costs and figuring out what a thing will cost, it's really hard to guess and predict. But if we get to the point where the board has some clear idea of the kind of ordinance it wants and the kinds of things it wants to allow, then we can do a bunch of math and a bunch of educated guesses and see how much that ordinance will probably cost. What will we need to enforce this ordinance? Without kind of that narrow thing, it's just an overwhelming amount of guesswork. When it comes to commercial cultivation, well, let me backtrack. When it comes to commercial activity, and it could be cultivation, it could be dispensaries, it could be manufacturing, it could be transportation. If they're applying for a permit, they're trying to get a county one, or they have a county one and a state one, there will be conditions on that permit. There will be things they have to do, and there'll be inspections like any other business. That might not be real outside the realm of what they are already doing. It might not be that hard. It might be the health inspector. It might be code enforcement. It might be building. But they're already doing it. They're already set to do it. We could kind of calculate the additional cost, but it probably isn't going to be overwhelming. What would be probably overwhelming is if code enforcement is going to go and try to enforce people who haven't tried to get permits, who haven't come forward and made themselves available. Code enforcement operates on complaints. They're not out in the community doing detective work trying to find people who aren't complying. So if there's a big illegal growth somewhere, it's not on federal or state land, it kind of otherwise is the county's deal, it's not compliant with codes, it could technically be code enforcement. If no one's complaining, code enforcement might not know about it. But if you take an activity that until recently was very illegal, is still kind of illegal, in some ways still very illegal, and you have people who are not even attempting to join that legitimate formal marketplace, it's the stance of code enforcement that those people are still dangerous. Code enforcement is not armed, and that's not going to be code enforcement's responsibility. They don't want anything to do with that. So, when we talk about the way the marketplace works, and in order for there to be this big exodus into the formal marketplace, there has to be a corresponding enforcement on black market activity. We all hope the state will do that on their especially on their land, but if the county wants code enforcement or the sheriff to do it, probably there's going to need to be some outlay of resources for the sheriff and code enforcement. They might be able to do something together, but it's not going to be, nuisance abatement, civil penalties for a, kind of a traditional black market grow. Theoretically, and this is kind of theoretical, but code enforcement isn't exactly unfunded, even though, there's $100,000 that just comes out of the general fund or whatever. Because the more people like the services a community offers, the higher property values go, as they're capitalized into property values, these services. So the question is, if we're looking at the cost of enforcement or the value of enforcement, the question would be, are these services being offered at an efficient rate? If we offered more, would property values go up correspondingly to cover them? And that is, I think, probably the most realistic way that code enforcement is going to be able to respond to the upcoming need. People have had neighbors and people on their streets growing pot for a while. Sometimes they complain. Dominic hasn't gotten a whole lot of marijuana complaints. But when a lot of people are growing 6 plants, or when they feel like they can do it more openly, I think you're going to see a lot more calls to code enforcement, a lot more expectation of code enforcement. And if the board is really expecting more from code enforcement, I just think it needs to be front and center that that's going to be a cash outlay, and the hopes to recoup it later. So, that's a pretty quick summation of our code enforcement versus law enforcement situation. I'm thinking probably only one more of these meetings to talk about tax, and then kind of a catch-all for other things. I know some of the board members might be inviting other people to speak, and we can keep maintaining a conversation. And if there are specific things that you'd like me to address, let me know either now or email me, and I can do that. We need to have an ordinance by the end of the year, some kind of ordinance. And so if the board knows what it wants now, I can start tailoring something and answering questions specific to that ordinance. But if not, at the end of the next meeting, it would really help if the board knows, you're looking at a ban until further notice. Are you looking at allowing some cultivation? Do you want to allow no cultivation but dispensaries, things like that? Any combination of those. If you'd like, I can draft multiple ordinances of different emphases, and the board can pick and then further tailor a specific one. So all of that can be done. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Appreciate it. So Joel, before you sit down, I'm going to have, just in case the board has questions for you specifically before you sit down, I want to make sure we go through that before we open it up to public comment. Jerry, get started.
I got a little bit lost in the permitting. Is there permits required for the 6 plants for your own
No.
medical use?
So currently, there's no, under the state regime of permits, you don't need one for the 6. But since we can put reasonable regulations on them, I think a permit could be a reasonable regulation that would allow us, at least up front, if you have a permit with a set of conditions and an inspection fee or something, we could at least on the front end see what you start with.
for medical.
For both, for medical or recreational, we could do that.
So we could require that. And then my other question, just because I don't know, is how many square feet does it take for 6 plants?
I don't know. There's an interesting study from the Rand Institute that estimates 1.4 square feet per plant. So these people will know better than I.
Well, I was just curious on the difference. If you're doing it commercially, you're allowed 100 square feet per care, if you're a caregiver, Did I hear you
So,
right?
okay, so there's a confusing amount of nuance about that particular situation. If you are doing 100 square feet or 500 square feet if you're a caregiver for up to 5 people,
Right.
you don't need a state permit. The state permitting kicks in above that level for medical only. For recreational, it's the 6 plants and then permits. But that is, there's a decriminalization for medical, and then there's permits that start at 100 feet. Under 100 feet, the county isn't under any obligation to allow up to 100 feet, 100 square feet.
I was just curious if it took 100 square feet
To grow 6.
6 plants, and it just doesn't seem equitable that you could be a caregiver and get 100 square feet if it only takes you 20 square feet to do 6 plants. I have no idea, so I'm just throwing numbers out there.
I also can't speak with any authority on
Okay.
how much space it takes. Other issues I don't know that if the public wants to address, is 6 plants enough to smell bad in your neighbor's yard? I don't know. Is that going to be a nuisance we get complaints about and we go out there, well, they don't have the 6, so sorry, it smells bad? I don't know.
And I think those are questions I think we all have as we begin to have this exchange. I know attending the city council meeting last night, an individual spoke to the point that these things could potentially be 10 feet in diameter and 18 feet tall. So, I mean, based on that observation, whether it's factual or not, I'm seeing a head nod in the back, yes. Is it reasonable for us to regulate the height or the size of a plant?
It could be. I think once you get there,
Then it gets into the weeds with code enforcement.
yeah, it gets into the code enforcement weeds.
So,
Yes.
Chris,
I didn't mean to go there.
And I have seen these pictures of these plants that are taller than a person and, huge in diameter. They need a lot of space. Those probably aren't indoor plants, right?
Sure.
But if somebody's got a big enough yard and there's 6 plants, yeah, I think it's conceivable that they're growing those.
Sure.
so we were in SAC and listening to state representatives. I think that's where the state's going more, and they're regulating small, medium, large grows by square footage, not so much
Per plant.
plants because of the size. So I think that's something we need to consider. My question is more on smell. I know we sat and had a meeting with somebody who does it, and there's ways of, because that's what's offensive to me. I don't want to smell it. I don't. And, can we regulate that? Can we make sure that they have the proper equipment on their grows if they're doing greenhouses that is not permeating out? Are we able to do that?
Supposedly, yes. Again, these people probably know better than me if it works.
Well, it does.
There's,
Right, you're shaking your head that there's certain equipment now that you guys can do greenhouses, and it keeps it all encompassed and all.
Denver does have rules about smell, and they have this bizarre
Who does?
machine, Denver,
Okay,
and they have this bizarre machine that smells things and measures the parts per fresh air. And so they get called all the time because people are smelling it in the neighborhood, and the guy goes out, and the thing doesn't read high enough to be a violation they have a specific level under their ordinance. It's how many parts of THC per fresh air or something and it's like this silly gun you put up. It's I don't know. Yeah, they've never had, at least as of writing this article, I can't remember how old it is, they never actually had a violation when that guy goes out to check. So if all of this stuff works, maybe it does, maybe they just weren't using it correctly in the neighborhood or whatever, but how do you then go into a nuisance hearing and say, well, I smelled it one day, it was bad, right? You can go, I smelled it on 5 occasions. And, well, does it smell now? That's the point of a nuisance. Does it smell right now? Well, maybe it will on the next windy day. I don't know. Those are tough questions. And so it'd be very convenient if 6 plants doesn't smell. That would just make life easy. But I'm not sure.
But we have current definitions with code enforcement on what defines a public nuisance. Is that what I heard you read off?
What we have is a list of things that are declared public nuisances. But one of them is anything declared a public nuisance at common law, right? Anything that in the traditional, old-fashioned, like British people sense of a nuisance can still, it's very broad.
Okay.
But there's a difference between a nuisance at law and a nuisance per se, or a nuisance in fact or a nuisance per se. Where a nuisance that is harming your neighbor's property, and the neighbor can prove it and show, here's the harms, here's what's done to my property values, that's always going to be a nuisance really no matter what it is. Whereas a nuisance per se is if it's a violation of the code, it's a nuisance. You don't have to prove that it's harmful. So, you know, by and large, the way we would do this is we set out a rule or a regulation and say you can't do this, and if you do it, it's a nuisance. Something like smell, you know, we can try to pick a level and say this much THC per parts per fresh air, whatever it is you know, a nuisance per se. Or you could go in and try to prove it's harming my property value. Or you could have a rule that says it can't be detectable outside your property, visually or scent or whatever, and if people can smell it, it's a violation. If I don't know how much of a hamper that's going to be, because you have to let them do 6 plants. If you have to let them do 6 plants and they can't control that smell, you know, we have a conflict that's going to resolve in favor of the 6 plants.
I guess it gets down to the reasonable nature of 6 plants, if we're just speaking specifically to that, not the commercial or medical piece, but specifically speaking to the state legislation, 6 plants and what is reasonable. And so if we were to toss out things to you, is it reasonable to require a greenhouse per se in a backyard setting? Is it reasonable to require a certain distance away from a neighbor's fence? Is it reasonable to require this certain level of smell? I mean, those are the kind of questions that I would have, especially if you got one neighbor who's looking to sell his property, doesn't believe in this and believes it's impacting his property value, and you got another neighbor that believes it wouldn't impact your property value. You want to essentially protect those private property rights.
Sure.
How do you begin to debate that in your own mind?
Well, the first thing is if there's a law that specifically says you can't make that regulation, our reasonable regulations can't be in conflict with state law. And so in the law that says you can have, you know, it says the county cannot completely prohibit somebody from growing 6 plants in their residence or on their property. I can't remember exactly, but it says in their residence or on their property. I interpret that to mean you can't stop them from doing it in their residence. If it's outside the property, the law as it's written says in a locked enclosure or some kind of locked thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean covered. If they've got an 8-foot chain link fence with a big old lock on it, and it's in their backyard, and you can't see it from a public place, that would be in compliance. We could, I think, yes, say you need to have it in a greenhouse. We could say you need to have it safe from access to children. I think you could go pretty far down the road. There's kind of a difference between what you think you could win in court and what you think could just avoid court altogether. And you know, we'd like to do the latter. But if they're going to have it, it has to be locked, and it's like in a bedroom in their house. Is a latch on a window locked? Is that safe? Is the fact that their house is locked mean that the pot is locked? You know, those are things that we could further divine if we wanted to, knowing that the only way to enforce it is if some accidental, code enforcement's there anyway, probably, for another thing.
Well, I'm passing along many of the questions that I've gotten since we've started these discussions several months ago, and I'm trying to bring those forward now so the questions are shared publicly, and knowing that we're probably going to have to anticipate much of this in crafting whatever this might look like on either a commercial, medical, or personal use side. I know Supervisor Berkowitz had a question. I'll turn the floor to him.
You know, I'm concerned about how we can protect our commercial growers from being preyed upon by criminals. We're dealing with a cash business at this particular juncture. You know, that's a heck of a lot of cash that they can be carrying around, and they can't deposit it in a bank at current regulations. This is a perfect opportunity for criminals. Do you foresee any state legislation that can make it possible for these people to be able to deposit the funds in some kind of institution? Because a person knows that you're growing hundreds of plants, and they know the money is in your house. It's a perfect opportunity for criminals.
So there are a lot of discussions about that on the state level, and I haven't looked too closely into them recently, but the last time I looked, there was discussion of a statewide bank specifically for this reason. And so instead of being federally insured, your federal deposit insurance, which is what prevents banks from taking money from illegal activities, this state would insure the deposits. And so you basically have a state marijuana bank. That might happen. I haven't checked recently. There's also a lot of kind of technology-driven things, kind of Bitcoin-y type things that might work or might not, where people are trying to find some alternative banking method that will work, and that might happen. As far as protecting people from the threat of just being robbed, you know, besides being really low-key about it, marijuana in most places that it's been legalized commercially has to be in fences that are opaque. It's not that much less conspicuous because you know it's in there. If grows are happening in warehouses, those can be, you know, covered with pretty extensive security systems that maybe a farm can't. You know, I think it's a good point. I think until this thing is no longer illegal out of state, it's going to be a black market, and you know, as long as they can't deposit their money, they're going to be a target. One thing that people are really hoping, I know, is one of the main points of this, and one of the reasons that growers are really on board with this, even though it's going to really eat into their bottom line to pay these taxes and fees, is they'd like to be able to call the police when somebody's messing with their stuff or robbing them. So depending on how many police calls that actually ends up being, you know, that's another source of expense for the county. You know, of policing a whole constituency they didn't before because nobody called the police.
Thank you. Supervisor Gittman.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I want to kind of refer back to the previous meeting when we talked about the taxes at the state level. I think you mentioned 27%. And you had it broken down, 15% excise, 9.25%. I'm not sure what that category was.
That's
2.75 leaves I have written down there. So
those aren't percentages, those are absolute dollars. So it's 15% excise.
Okay.
And it's $9.25 per ounce of leaves and $2.75 or, you know, $2.25 per ounce of all non-leaves.
Here's my concern. You know, again, we have a civil, which is the code enforcement officer for compliance, and we have a beleaguered law enforcement arm in the county, the sheriff. You call them up and you want to get some results, there's just not the staff. So the only way to mitigate that problem is to put in more taxes on this product to generate the kind of personnel where someone is upset about something, an odor or whatever, or an actual crime, that there is staff to cover it. And I don't know what that number is, Joel, but it's, if you're talking about 15% on the start at excise tax at the state level, and there's no law enforcement component in that, that would concern me as to how much money we have to do to control this, what I would have to call is a problematic product. We're bringing something into the, it's a plebiscite-driven item. This is not passed by the Assembly or the Senate and signed by the governor. This is the people who have decided on this. So That's one concern that I have and
Well,
continue to have.
just to be fair to the state, and the state has done plenty wrong here, but just to be fair to them, there is some money in that 15% that will be set aside for grants to law enforcement if we apply for them. The realisticness of getting those, I can't speak to. It's like there's this list of things the money goes to, and the last one.
So we'll be competing with 57 other counties for those grants.
Yeah, and the other thing is that as far as the medical regime was passed by the legislature, it's the recreational that was a proposition.
I know, it doesn't affect the 6 plants. The other issue, and I'm waiting to hear, you haven't addressed the federal component on this, and I have some information. The National Drug Control Policy was announced today and during the Trump administration for the upcoming budget that the President has submitted $27.8 billion in drug control efforts, including prevention, treatment, and law enforcement. Specifically, it supports $1.3 billion in investments for a number of programs, comprehensive addiction and recovery. So, and at the Attorney General level, they're clearly taking this matter as a serious matter. The state of California is in conflict with what I can only term is a substantial investment. 12.1 billion of that money is going to be for treatment and prevention efforts. 15.6 billion requests for law enforcement, interdiction, and international initiatives. 10.8 billion in treatment funding, which is an increase of 2% from 2017. This goes on, and the Trump administration has absolutely reversed the Obama administration toward its attitude on this product. It reversed the decision, the practice by former Attorney General Holder to go after those people who are doing the kinds of things that this we're making legal now. So that does concern me. It concerns me about the amount of money we're going to need to combat this, to even stay not just treading water, because I can see that this is going to be problematic on our law enforcement community, our code enforcement officer, which is only one person. I'm wondering how much money, and I'm thinking this out as I'm writing notes down, how much money we're going to need to have the proper intervention to control this, again, I'll repeat it, what I can only consider as a problematic product for Delaware County.
Well, are you asking how much it's going to cost? I mean, what was the specific question?
No, I'm not asking you. I just see that there's a conflict here. And this is not going to go away at this level. This is going to be staged at a different level, at a higher level than us, whether this California decision to do this will even be legal.
Well, you know, when we get into issues of like federal preemption and things like that, there's a fascinating body of law about the federal courts have held that we're not preempted from doing it, even though it's not federally legal just because we're doing it. You know, the state is within its right to not enforce criminal penalties against it. But you know, when you get down to what is going to happen in our county and the effects on our code enforcement and law enforcement, you know, what happens at the federal level is fairly remote. When something happens, it looks like it'll affect us, we can take that into account. One legal question that I think is really relevant to you all is, are you complicit in racketeering? If you are aiding and abetting? I'm not going to offer you an opinion on it.
You're talking about the board.
The board. Are you the board? Because, you know, everybody else is on their own. I advise you all. But I can't tell you with 100% certainty that you're safe.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I also can't tell you that you're like facing a bunch of liability, but you know, there's a provision in the Federal Controlled Substances Act that says that local officials do have qualified immunity when they're enforcing state or local law. I'm not going to promise you that that is really going to cover you. You might not be enforcing it when you're creating it.
We may ask council to opine on this someday.
I got my eyes open for people with smart ideas on that subject, but so far everybody's just kind of waiting.
Okay.
The State Attorney General, Mr. Becerra, has openly challenged the Justice Department for a fight on this issue. That doesn't mean it's going to protect you all if the Justice Department tries to do something.
Yeah. So,
Del Norte is possibly the last place they'll come, but it doesn't change the fact that, you know, the liability's there, the laws are the laws.
understood. Thank you, Joe.
I don't mean to alarm you by saying that.
No worries. None of us are alarmed.
Anything else?
Go ahead
Linda?
and bring the Kleenex for us, too. I'm going to go ahead and, if you don't mind, turn it open to public comment at this point. Joel, we might request for you to come back. If there's some public comment that we can't answer, we might ask you to address some of that after we hear it. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and open it up for public comment at this time. You could address issues specific to anything associated with marijuana, is what we're addressing here today. Please try to keep your comments to 3 minutes or less, and address our comments specifically with the board. And then if there's a comment that we need to address with county council, the board will ask that question back to council at that time. So when you approach the dais, please state your name. And let's go ahead and get it started. I see a familiar face from our city council meeting last night.
Good evening, Board. Jim Nelson. You need my address?
No, we don't.
Okay. Like it or not, it's here. So you're either for it or against it, but it really doesn't make any difference now. The important issue is passing an ordinance that's going to be good for the grower as well as the public. So by chance, I happen to be friends with the man who wrote the rules or the laws for cannabis for the state of California and for Nevada and a couple other places. So I've been talking with him, and he suggested that we might take a look at the ordinance that Lake County passed. I do have copies of that ordinance for you, so that we could fine-tune it a little bit and probably make it work for Del Norte County. At the same time, he's pretty busy, so he referred me to his assistant, Brian Webster, who has worked along with him. I called him this evening, talked to him. Of course, he wants to be paid a little bit, so I asked him what kind of fees are we talking if he's really needed, and he said, well, probably $1,000 a month. Knowing our county, we probably don't have any money, so I think if you choose to go this route, I think that I could probably get some free advice from my friend, who's the guy who wrote the laws for it. He does suggest that you do not try to put a ban on cultivation at this time, because that will stimulate a lot of lawsuits by the activist groups. The ordinance that Lake County established has been tried and proved, and so far has survived any legal ramifications, so I guess that's good. Like I said, we're probably a little bit different here than other areas, but it's quite a few pages of ordinance that they passed, and it's definitely something that the board could look at and see if it's something that could work for our county. And he states that basically if it gets fine-tuned, it's actually something that we could pass within a month or two and have an effect. So anyway, I'll leave some copies for you to look at.
Please,
and maybe it will help.
Thank you for leaving those with Kylie. Thank you, Jim. Public comment. Please. Yes, you.
Okay. Good evening, Supervisors. My name is Jake Smith. I live in Smith River, the ground zero for marijuana cultivation. I am here for myself and also to support my good neighbors, the Alexanders. I watched the meeting last month, and I know Blake came and talked about the marijuana cultivation. Where I live, and our deputy council described it as being very pastoral. It is pastoral. I live in a beautiful section of Smith River, lots of nice farmland, and lately I wake up and I have nightmares about waking up and looking at 8-foot fences, razor wire on the top, pit bulls on chains. Who knows? But I do know that right now in Smith River, we have a lot of drug crime out there. And to me, if we allow the cultivation, it's just going to add to it. I live out there, I've experienced it. We don't have a regular sheriff out there in Smith River right now. And now tonight I'm hearing that even funding for more law enforcement is questionable. That just adds to it. And if it was just somebody growing their own 6 plants, I would say that would be fine. But the cultivation to me just brings another new headache for this county. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Don't be shy. And don't hurt yourself, for sure.
Good evening. My
Good
name is
evening.
Mario Westphal. I think you guys got your work cut out for you. Like this gentleman just said, as far as somebody growing 6 plants in their home for medical use, I don't think that's a big issue. I mean, I think there's issues to be taken into consideration even with that. But I think the bigger issue lies in the cultivation and the commercial growing. It's a developing issue in the state. And just like all the other 57 counties, they're all trying to figure out how to do the best way about it. With any new industry or any industry that's in a county, there's aspects that come along, and especially fiscal aspects, considerations for environmental impact. These all have to be considered. There is the watershed impacts, pesticides, allergens. We're just looking at different neighboring counties, and up in Josephine County, my sister-in-law lives there, and so they're already heavy into it, and they're having a lot of problems with people now reacting with their asthma and COPD when the plants are pollinating. They're having growers in residential areas. I mean, it's one thing to have something that's in a certain zoned area, and it's not going to impact directly residential, but if you have it. My neighborhood, for instance, just found out that it's a residential neighborhood, but there is a couple lots that directly adjoin and they're agricultural zoned. Somebody already started putting things into place with the intent of commercial cultivating. And, that's, I mean, we have kids right next door. You have a direct impact on a residential neighborhood. So I think that's one of those things that you as the council have to take into consideration is if you should allow cultivating, should there be specific zones set aside for that, because it's very impacting. Let me see the pollination, I covered that, yeah, like he was mentioning, health, safety, and welfare, that's to existing residents and residents that have been here in the county and poured their life savings or lives into establishing a neighborhood, homes, whatever. I think that's a primary concern. Having a new industry come in, all fine and good, but what is it all about, right? They're looking to, it's an industry, they're looking to make money. So the fiscal aspect that comes with it, of code enforcement, whether law enforcement, whatever it is, really should impact that industry mostly rather than existing residents, and carry in another financial burden that obviously this county is already strapped for. That's essentially my 2 cents. Thank you very
Excellent.
much
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Well timed.
My name is Mark Steinkamp, and I noticed an interesting property that's right outside of the city limits, the old billiard facility, and I think that's up for rent, and I heard that it was a stolen car chop shop, and got busted out for that. Maybe that's not right. But anyway, that's in county property, and I would think that would be a great facility for a farmer's market, where local growers could sell their products just in that building. It's very big, and basically set up booths similar to the farmers markets that sells vegetables. So I think that would be an interesting concept to control the sales of it and make sure you get your tax money and is protected from crime and from, making crime. And then I also left articles for you out of the May 31st, 2017 edition of Psychiatric Times, which is really the premier psychiatric magazines for psychiatric professionals. And they're starting to do quite a bit of study on cannabis, and they have found out that in many cases of mental illness, that cannabis is just as effective as modern antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and it has a lot better side effect profile. One of the things about cannabis is it's acutely effective. All psychiatric medications, you basically start off very slow in your dose and you titrate up. It takes a month to 6 weeks before you get up to speed where you're not depressed, or you're not psychotic, or you're not suicidal. And I think one thing we have in this county is a real suicide problem. And I put that not just for Del Norte County with the circumstances of the economic environment, but rural counties are having real suicide problems, and I think we have that problem. And I could almost see a facility where there would be the first medical or marijuana mental health wellness center where people could go if they feel suicidal and smoke a joint and talk with people. And I think you get drunk and you shoot yourself, you smoke joints and you go get some ice cream. And hopefully, I think we could prevent some suicides with marijuana. So, thank you.
Jody Smith. I'm one of the people that I believe people here have mentioned, not by name, but anyway, I own some property that's zone agricultural, and I'm planning on doing marijuana grow. I was in an accident last year, and I suffered some really bad headaches, nausea, vomiting. The marijuana does help with all those symptoms quite a bit. I never was a smoker before, but it's helped me so much that I decided that I want to help my fellow man by growing it for other people. And I think I have a right to do so since California did pass those laws. My property is zone agricultural, and I'm getting all the needed permits and trying to do everything legally and above board. So I don't see a problem with that. People like me should, we should be not reprimanded, but say, hey, you're doing a good job. You're trying to do everything legally and get all the legal permits and do it right. So I just want to give a shout out to the people that are trying to do it the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Isaiah O'Connell. I'm actually working with Jody, trying to help her. And I just wanted to say that, like she said, we're building a structure, a completely enclosed greenhouse. When problems with the water, we do everything completely organic. It's it's really making a difference. I'm actually right now, curing the side effects of Parkinson's in 27 patients. I see the power of this medicine. And there's a lot of air around it that has been burned into all of us our whole lives, about how it's a negative thing. And truly, marijuana or cannabis is a completely symbiotic plant to the human. Every cannabinoid in that plant is already contained within you. We share the same 60 cannabinoids that are in the plant in our body. That's what creates the immune system in your body. We are just trying, I'm personally trying to help people, and that's what this is doing. And, like this, as long as you are, I have kids myself, I don't want my child around it. I don't want her in the garden, as long as it's locked You know, it's a sealed building, you know, there's a fence around it. It's not, you know, hurting anyone, you know, it's not affecting the, you know, the neighborhood, you know. It's, we're all gonna have to deal with it, you know, regardless. And, you know, I just hope you guys find a way to really implement it and make it a positive thing, and not look at it as such a criminal element anymore, you know, because the majority of people out here are good people, you know. You're not going to have to deal with the criminal element on the majority, you know. Now, there always is a criminal element in anything, whether, you know, be white-collar Wall Street crime or, you know, selling dope on the corner, you know. There's going to be an element always, but the more we put focus on the negative, the more it happens, you know. We have to change that mind state, you know. It's all in that, you know. It's how we look at it. It's perception, you know. And I feel like, you know, it's moving forward, you know, and it's a good thing, you know. So I hope you guys, you know, can come to a good, you know,
Thank you.
conclusion, you know. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Mr., before you step down, I just need to clarify, were you specifically referring to a medical facility?
Yes.
A medical greenhouse?
Yes.
And not recreational?
No.
Okay, thank you
Yeah,
very much.
complete medical.
Appreciate
it. Yep. No problem.
Any public comment? Any additional public comment at this time? Please.
I'm Robert Dorigo. I'm a county resident, manager of Del Norte Patients Together. At the last workshop, comments were made that federal law trumps state, and in Rach V. Gonzalez, it does. However, the decision was, of course, not unanimous, and the future is begging Americans to make their own opinions. In his dissent, Justice Thomas wrote of the precedent's potential to further erode civil liberties we take for granted. Whether Congress aims at the possession of drugs, guns, or any other number of items, it may continue to appropriate state police powers under the guise of regulating commerce. He continues, if the majority is to be taken seriously, the federal government may now regulate quilting bees, clothing drives, and potluck suppers throughout the 50 states. This makes a mockery of Madison's assurance to the people of New York that the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined, while those of the state are numerous and indefinite. And so I ask you, does the federal government have the right to ban Roger Gitlin from owning old cars? Does the federal government have the right to keep Bob from selling radio advertising when he owned his radio station? Does the federal government have the right to keep you from renting equipment, Supervisor Hemmingson? Does the federal government have the right to stop Supervisor Howard from selling Blake Alexander's eggs? How about Supervisor Cohen's ability to sell homes or fish and chips and beer? The states have the right under the 10th Amendment to regulate these activities. In 1920, our nation demonstrates this when the 18th Amendment to our Constitution was enacted to prohibit alcohol. I cannot help but notice that a quite destructive drug required an amendment to the Constitution to ban. Why is that not the case? Why is the case for alcohol but not for cannabis? Why is the law not consistent, and why am I not being represented locally? Why will you not take some risk with your constituents and stand for a country we're standing for? Representatives represent me, and start writing the next step in the chain in support of states' rights in regards to cannabis reform. My voice whimpers compared to yours, and I ask you not to change your opinion of cannabis, but to support your ideals and principles of a liberty-rich nation of democracy and unflinchingly accurate representation. Even if your constituents suffer from obnoxious gas and so require you to relay our expressions with farts into the microphone, it is the duty of the fart-stricken that we have elected you for. Your obligation is clear. I think that our leaders get lost counting political capital, and to represent the weak they fear would leave them associated with weakness. Let your capital not be political but principle. We elected you to act with principle and ethics and to take risks with and on behalf of us. As for the rest of the board, why not comment? Is your very breath this political capital that I've heard is so finite? It is polite when a guest farts to try not to take notice. However, we are not farting. We are participating in our government, and our choice is clear. I see my time is up. Would like to leave you guys, some of this is cited, with some information about how cannabis might impact us locally. Every 2% of the state demand at pre-wholesale distribution equals 25% of our GDP and would serve to double our entire private sector economy. I would like to leave you with letters from Dr. Russell Nichols of Smith River. He would like to have attended tonight. We were assured that we would have an abundant time to prepare, but we had the same amount of time that we always have, which is the legal limit of 72 hours to post the agenda. We didn't receive enough time. You know, Dr. Nichols has a schedule. And so these are his letters. And then I wanted to leave you all, I wanted to leave this book for all of you. It's a children's book about marijuana. I don't know if I would necessarily want my kid to have it, but I think it does reflect how the pop culture mentality generation, us, are going to talk to our kids about pot. We're not going to tell them that we're just scumbags. But it's just for Roger. And for pure, research purposes. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, Mr. Drew. Okay, any further public comment before we bring it back to the board? Got one more taker. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Roger D'Elia. I was in the military for 8 years. I ran detachments. I ran the psychological operations at a Grissom Air Force Base. I evaluated Rangers, MPs. I evaluated what our systems have placed and allowed me to see, which wasn't very good. These soldiers coming back, I came up here when I heard the word nightmare. This is helping them, regardless whether you'd like to admit it. There's more positive than negative. There's going to be positive and negative things about no matter what you do. Your shoe comes untied sometimes. Why'd you put a shoe on that day? You tripped. Oh well, we understand. More positive than negative. What direction are we willing to go? I moved all the way across the United States to try and do something right in an area where I saw that it was more positive than negative. Like Isaiah said, what are we going to focus on? Are we going to keep building bombs? Or are we going to keep trying to focus and come together to allow systems that have more hope to work? That's something that we really need to think about. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening, Supervisors. Stephanie Alexander. And you guys are elected to care for our community. And I know you guys all personally, not because you're supervisors, but just because all of our involvement in our community, and most of you because you have kids or grandkids. And our family is here to speak about the kids in our community. And we are 5th generation in Humboldt County. My husband was born and raised in Humboldt County, and we know the culture of marijuana. We know the culture of growing cannabis. I have on my Google Maps on my phone that I share with people on Highway 36, kind of by Hayfork area. And it's just a travesty at what it's done to the environment out there and what it looks like. Sometimes I live, and my friends and I live in a silo, and we just don't know the cannabis world. And I look at that picture and I share that and show them what it means to our communities, what it does. And we know in Humboldt County what it does. We know 2nd, 3rd generation marijuana growers, and we're not happy with that culture. And I do not want to see, our family does not want to see that kind of culture develop in our community. And I ask you to think about the kids, your kids, my kids, and my future grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you. Further public comment? Okay, we're going to go ahead and bring it back to the board at this time and close public comment. Any additional questions for Joel's or comments from? Oh, my apologies. I didn't. A little late to the mic. Please, feel free.
I want to speak as well. Jesse Davis, 3rd District.
Jesse.
Thanks for the evening, and we all appreciate everything you do for the community here. And I'm one of 6 founding members of the Del Norte Growers Association, and I think we're attempting to set a community-oriented tone that's all-inclusive, and we're hoping to hear that tone echoed back from the board. I don't envy your job. You definitely have your work cut out for you, as others have said. You've got an extremely important decision to make about a topic that you know almost nothing about and have very little personal experience with. In all my jobs I've worked in, businesses that I've run, knowledge helps, but experience is where it counts. And I think anybody who's run a business knows that, or any aspect of life, really. So we're here to help you guys, and we appreciate meetings like this where you appear to be interested in learning. Hopefully that's real. Hard to tell, you know. I have daughters. I have 2 daughters, 7 and 13. Tender age and lots of challenges. Lots of things scare me that I don't know about, things I'm going to have to deal with as they grow up. And but cannabis isn't one of them. I'm not concerned about how I'm going to talk to my girls about cannabis. My older daughter, I already do. It's that age, you know. There's all other concerns that I'm much more worried about, you know, that come with growing up. And I think the reason why I'm not concerned about cannabis with my kids is because I know all about it. I have lots of personal experience with it, negative and positive. I've seen people ruin their lives with cannabis. I've seen people save lives with cannabis. And I've seen that with lots of other things too. Driving, firearms, sex. A lot of things that need to be dealt with intelligently, with lots of thought and care for the community. And if we don't, then everybody's going to lose if we pretend like it doesn't exist or it's going to go away or whatever. So we've got a lot of work to do for sure. I don't know how it's going to work out or how you guys are going to learn or how everybody's got different opinions are going to come together. I have no idea how that's going to work. But I know Del Norte has a really neat and interesting opportunity to not be like Humboldt County and all the problems that have grown there. You know, I have property in Humboldt County too. It's a mess. It's a damn mess. And I know a lot of people who want to leave because it's what's going on there is not helping. The Board of Supervisors there did not do a favor to Humboldt. Their pockets are in it. They're making money off of selling grow properties. And that's why they didn't care. That's why they didn't put a residency requirement in their ordinance. People from all over the world are coming, making a mess of it. It's the prohibition culture, the black market culture that made a mess of cultivation, and that's what we need to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And to Mr. Davis's point, I just want to say the board is taking an extraordinary amount of time and a great length of time to devote county council's attention to this and special workshops to really be as transparent as possible in a decision that's going to be very tough, as you have recognized. And I want to make sure that's communicated properly to everybody involved because it does impact 2 sides of the fence here. And it's going to be a tough decision, but we're going to continue down this road in a transparent manner. So when we come to a point that hopefully is in time for council to react with a potential ordinance or a ban, depending on where this board lies, we give them time to do that. But we want to hear from everyone. And I think these workshops are the perfect venue for it, and I really appreciate the participation and the public comment that we've heard here this evening. Any additional public comment before I close tonight? Just one. Please approach if... Good evening. Please state your name for the record.
I'm Victoria. I just moved up to this county.
Last name Victoria?
Thank you. I've been asked
No,
to read
your last
this.
name Victoria?
Oh, Ahuna.
Okay, thank you very much.
I've been asked to read this letter from Dr. Russell Nichols. It has come to my attention that the Board of Supervisors is discussing the place of cannabis in Del Norte County. A discussion about the place of cannabis in our community would not be complete without discussing the potential health benefits that cannabis can help to achieve in Del Norte. In my practice, I have found cannabis to be an irreplaceable tool in the battle against chronic pain and opioid dependence. Given our remote location and the constrained resources of our community's inhabitants, local access to medicinal cannabis is something not to be taken for granted. I support county policy that does not further stigmatize the use of cannabis as medicine nor marginalize the people who use it as such. Russell Nichols, MD. I can attest also that I'm a medicinal cannabis patient officially since 2009, and without it I would be addicted to opioids and very sick. They were destroying my liver and my kidneys, and I suffer from chronic pain since the age of 12. I have spinal compression and other injuries, and it has made my life so much better having medicinal cannabis legally and safely available to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close public comment at this time. Bring it back to the board for additional comments from the supervisors and any questions for Joel, and then we'll go ahead and wrap that up. Do we have any comments from the board? Supervisor Gitlin.
Firstly, we're not talking about medical marijuana tonight. And I want to say that clearly because I keep hearing that argument brought out. We are talking about recreational marijuana. Ms. Smith, I do see a problem with this product. In my quiet moments when I'm not sitting in a meeting like this, I have to ask myself a question about this product. Cannabis, marijuana, weed, pot, whatever you want to call it, is it a safe product? And the answer in my brain comes back immediately, no, it is not. We're looking, excuse me, ma'am. The purpose of this product is to create an artificial state of euphoria for the end user. We are looked to challenge how we can keep this out of the hands of children. And ladies and gentlemen in this audience, I have seen the effects that marijuana has caused in devastating our youth, closing up options. I won't sit for it. It's unfair to do this to our children, and yes, it will get into the hands of our kids. There's nothing you can do about that. I don't care what kind of a law you have. This is going to impact our children. Normalizing this product will cause a negative impact not only on Del Norte County with its limited law enforcement, code enforcement, and taxing needs, but throughout our country, our state, and our country. I cannot allow our youth to be subjected to a future where marijuana, cannabis, pot is mainstream. And we grow up with this as a normal product as if it were alcohol or some other product that he says, okay, now, Mr. Chairman, I would appreciate the audience on quiet while I'm speaking. They had their opportunity. It is inappropriate for anyone to be yelling out.
Thank you.
Okay, now, so, Ms. Smith, Mr. Davis, we've discussed this product before. I cannot support any kind of normalization of this product into our community. From everything I've known and experienced about it in the past, nothing has changed my mind tonight or in previous cannabis workshop meetings. I say this to you, and again, I'm addressing Mr. DeRigo, who says you need to have the courage to stand up and take a position, and I am, and I will, that this is a product which will devastate our county long-term, and I won't sit still for it, and that is my comment.
Thank you, Supervisor. Supervisor Berkowitz?
With all due respect to my colleague, Supervisor Gitlin, it's a state law. The voters have spoken, all right? They have made their choice of what they want to do. But I heard two speakers tonight, Stephanie Alexander and Jesse Davis. Two different points of view. But one interesting fact, we're not Humboldt County. We know that Humboldt County is a mess. The reason probably that it's a mess is because that product has been grown by people who are doing it illegally. It's not been regulated. And that's why we have this huge problem in Humboldt County. If we decide to do this in Del Norte County, we can take advantage of their problems. We don't want the same problems. So I respect two people tonight that have different points of view. Both of them I've gotten to know and respect. And I'm going to take a look and I'm going to study this. I'm not going to give you my decision tonight, but I want to study it and I want to see if we do this, we're going to develop a policy that will avoid those problems that we've had in Humboldt County and any of these other counties, in Colorado. We can do this if we decide to do it, but we'll do it right.
A couple things. I mean, I really appreciate that we're having these open and frank conversations. It is legal, or it's going to be legal next year, and it's fairly important that we all together decide how we're going to control that, regulate that, whatever the policies are. I have a lot of my own personal opinions on it, but I am here to listen to everybody's side. I was concerned that you guys said that you only had 2 days' notice. This is our third meeting. You guys have all known that we're doing workshops, so maybe we knew when the meeting was a couple of weeks ago. I think it's important that you guys have more than 2 days. I understand when the agenda was posted. I know when those are posted, but we have been having a series of cannabis meetings set up, so maybe there's a little bit better way that we can get it out there before. I mean, we knew weeks ago when we were having it for that as well. But it is true what Bob is saying, we do need to regulate it. I guess I am more on the side of the air of just being more stringent on it, and I'm concerned that things are happening already in our county that aren't being regulated. To the fact of law enforcement, I think that's all, when we talk about permits and that type of stuff, that's where the money's going to come in to help us with law enforcement. So I guess that comes up to us. I mean, if we're willing to put a price on that, we're going to make sure that that price is going to cover what it is going to cost us to oversee this. Whatever it is, if it's, you know, another code enforcement person, that's when the licenses and the permits come in and those fees, that's what will help us do that. And I think you said it earlier, Joel, whatever we decide to do, there's going to be a cost to that. And that's when we're going to have to figure it out. I don't know where we're going to end up. I think we definitely need some more talking about it. Mr. Gitlin is wrong. We are talking about medical as well as recreational. Those also have to be monitored and policies done. Whether it is a complete ban, whether it is a loose ban, whatever it comes down to, we have to make that decision together. We have to live with state laws.
Thank you, Supervisor. Supervisor Hemmingson.
Yeah, you know, Supervisor Cowan makes a good point, as well as Bob, to, you know, most of us who look at a situation like to get all the information before they make a decision. And that's what I think we're trying to do. Most of us are trying to do on this board, you know, without having all the information and just spouting out, you know, an opinion, I don't think is the proper thing to do. So I'm certainly waiting. I'm learning everything. I think Joel's doing an outstanding job of giving us information on each section of what we need to know, and so I'm waiting to hear the rest of it. And at that point, we'll have discussions and we'll make a decision. It'd be very interesting to see what these ordinances look like if Joel's going to put 2 or 3 of them together. So it'll be interesting to get a flavor of what that's going to look like. So I'm just waiting to get more information.
Thank you, Supervisor. So we will continue to have these workshops. We'll try to notice them a little bit better next time, so folks feel like they have a fair shake at getting here, or at least notifying those who might be interested to come and speak to the board on this matter, whether you're for it or against it. We want to hear from everybody. I've heard from Joel tonight that we'll essentially be looking at 2 meetings, one specific to taxation and one specific to a catch-all, so a cleanup. In addition, I've done some outreach. Some of us had the opportunity to see a presentation at the California State Association of Counties this December from John Young, who's the Ag Commissioner of Yolo County. John presented a fairly fair approach to Yolo County, who has been basically had an ordinance in place for about 1.5 years. So I've invited John here to basically give us a financial picture. So looking at the ordinances that they've put in place and the impact to government services and how much that impact has cost their community, what that might look like, and then the taxation essential piece that's come out of it. It'll help give this board a better idea of how a community is essentially 1.5 years ahead of us is currently being impacted, pro and con. I think it'll allow this board to ask questions of John, with hopefully getting some responses from him that will help guide our decision process, and it'll also help the community become educated in what those potential impacts might be, especially since we hear a lot that this could be an economic boon to our community and help with some economic development issues that we've been having, where others believe it won't. So I want to make sure that everything is presented fairly. This might help us, at least in a community that's had this discussion and had this discussion now for quite some time. We'll look to converse with County Council's office to ensure that the community is well informed going forward, but at least right now I foresee 3 additional meetings prior to us having a meeting where Joel potentially would craft some ordinances for us to consider and potentially vote on at that time. Appreciate everybody's time this evening and hanging in there with us. Have a good evening, and we'll talk to you soon.